He arrived without warning. No entourage. No media. No sound but the dry crunch of the earth beneath his boots. The guards at the border post didn't recognize him at first. A tall man in a worn jacket, sunglasses tucked in his shirt, walking. Like a ghost who had nothing left to run from. But Traoré did. He stood at the far end of the encampment, staring into the twilight sky, when a soft voice said from behind, "You don't know me." Traoré didn't turn. He just replied, calm and certain, "I do." They didn't shake hands. Didn't smile. Didn't speak again for hours. The sun dipped. The fire rose. And there, in the heart of the Sahel, two men sat side by side, one with the weight of nations on his shoulders, the other with a face known across continents, but eyes that looked like they hadn't truly seen peace in years. Keanu Reeves didn't come as a celebrity. He came as a man who had tried to stay quiet for too long. Traoré passed him a simple metal cup of water. No words. Keanu held it like it might spill something sacred. And in that vast silence, something unspoken passed between them. The kind of silence that only grief understands. The kind of stillness that isn't empty, but full of every word too painful to say. No one approached them. The guards stayed back. Even the wind seemed to slow, as if the desert itself wanted to listen. Keanu stared into the fire like it might burn through memory. His voice, when it finally came, was a whisper. "I failed someone I loved." Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't ask, "Who?" Didn't lean in. Didn't react like the world would if it heard a man like Keanu Reeves admit something so raw. He simply nodded, once like he'd seen this kind of regret before. And Keanu went on. "She waited for me. I promised I'd be there, and I wasn't." His hands were trembling. It wasn't the work. It wasn't the distance. It was me. I was afraid of being what she needed. The fire cracked, and for a moment, Keanu's eyes reflected it like a man seeing his own soul go up in flames. "I never told anyone," he said. "Not really. The press made stories. The tabloids guessed. But they never knew her. Not like I did." Traoré was still silent. But something in his posture changed. A soft lean forward. A slow exhale. Like he was holding that grief with him, not just hearing it. Keanu wiped his face, as if ashamed of the tears forming. "I thought if I just kept moving, I wouldn't feel it. I'd buried it under scripts, premieres, charity, motorcycles. God, I even buried it under kindness." He laughed. A bitter, broken laugh. "I thought healing meant doing good things. But I never sat still long enough to feel the bad ones." That's when Traoré finally spoke. "One time, when I was a teenager, I lied to my brother." His voice was low, almost too soft to hear. He was going into something dangerous, and I told him I'd be there, that I'd watch his back, but I didn't go. I made excuses. Keanu looked over slowly, breath caught in his chest. "He didn't come back," Traoré said. Then silence again. The weight of that shared failure filled the space between them like smoke. No judgment, no pity. Just two men, both marked by a moment they couldn't undo. Keanu leaned back, gazing up at the stars slowly emerging above the African sky. "I think I've never truly said her name out loud since she left." Traoré didn't press him to say it. Instead, he picked up a stick and drew something in the sand. A circle, then two lines crossing inside it, like a symbol of connection. Keanu stared at it. "What is that?" he asked. Traoré looked at him, eyes steady. "It means nothing. Broken stays broken forever." And for the first time all night, Keanu closed his eyes, not in pain, but in release. Like something inside him had just taken its first breath in years. Keanu's eyes remained closed, but his chest began to rise and fall differently now. Slower, fuller, like each breath was dragging some old ghost out from deep inside. The kind of breath a man takes when he's not sure if he's dying inside, or just finally beginning to live. The wind had picked up slightly. Not harsh, but gentle, like fingers brushing across the firelight, playing with the embers the way memory plays with the heart. And for a while, they sat like that. No one moved. No one filled the silence. The only sound was the crackle of wood and the distant howl of something ancient. Maybe wind, maybe spirit. In this part of the world, you learn not to question what the night carries. Keanu finally opened his eyes. He didn't look at Traoré at first, just stared into the symbol drawn in the dirt. The lines were starting to blur with the wind, fading, like everything else he had tried so hard to forget. But then, he spoke again. "She used to tell me," he began, voice fragile, "that I don't have to fix everything. That sometimes just being there was enough. But I didn't believe her. I thought I needed to become someone better before I could deserve her love." He shook his head and his voice cracked. "But the truth was, she already loved the broken version of me. And I left anyway." Traoré's eyes didn't flinch. He didn't ask for her name or what happened next. He just listened. The kind of listening that lets a man speak without being interrupted by pity. Keanu reached into his jacket and pulled out something small, wrapped in worn cloth, edges curled and frayed. "This," he said softly, "was the last thing she gave me." He unwrapped it slowly, carefully, as if it might vanish if touched too fast. Inside, a simple pendant, nothing flashy. A stone, round and dark, tied with old leather string. But the moment it hit the firelight, a strange shimmer flickered in its surface, like it held something deeper than reflection. Traoré leaned. And slightly, she called it her anchor. Said it reminded her of who she was when things got too loud. Keanu held it for a moment, then passed it to Traoré's open palm. "She told me once, if you ever get lost, hold this. And remember that someone believed in you, even when you didn't believe in yourself." Traoré studied the pendant for a long time. Then he nodded slowly, and without a word, pulled something from his own pocket, a small carved stone, worn smooth by time, shaped like a leaf. He placed it beside the pendant in the dirt between them. "I carry this," Traoré said quietly. "My mother gave it to me before the coup. Said it was from her father, and his before him." Keanu looked at both tokens lying in the firelight, two objects from two lives that couldn't be more different. And yet, somehow, they spoke the same language. "She ever forgive you?" Keanu asked, barely above a whisper. Traoré didn't look up. "No," he replied. "She died before I ever got the chance to say sorry." A long pause. "But that night," he continued, "I sat beside her, grave until the sun rose. And I said everything I was too proud to say when she was alive. Every word, every regret." He turned his head, eyes still locked on the flames. "And when the wind picked up, I heard something, not a voice. Just stillness. The kind that wraps around your chest and makes you feel like you're being held." Keanu swallowed, the firelight catching the wetness in his eyes. "I've never said her name aloud," he admitted again. "Not even at the funeral." Traoré nodded once. "Then maybe it's time." Keanu hesitated, his jaw clenched, then loosened. His fingers trembled, his lips parted. And for a second, the sound nearly came out, the name that had haunted every silent room he ever walked into since that day. But nothing came. His throat locked. His heart surged like it was fighting itself. He clenched his fists and looked away, ashamed. "I can't," he said. Traoré didn't try to force it, didn't console him. Instead, he reached into his satchel, pulled out a small wooden box, and placed it gently between them. "Open?" Keanu looked at him, confused but complied. Inside the box was a tiny wooden carving. It looked old, hand-cut, its shape weathered with time. It was a simple sculpture of two figures sitting under a tree. No face details, no elaborate features, just the posture, one leaning slightly into the other. Silent companionship. "This," Traoré said, "was made by a boy in a village we helped rebuild. He'd lost everything, parents, siblings, even his voice. But when he saw me sitting with an old man under a mango tree, he carved this, said nothing, just placed it in my hand and walked away." Keanu picked up the carving with both hands, studying the curve of the figures. There was something sacred about it, like it held memory deeper than words. "I've carried it for 5 years, Traoré said. "But tonight, I think it belongs to you." Keanu looked up slowly. "Why?" he asked. Traoré gave him a long, unwavering stare. "Because you showed up when you could have stayed gone. You brought your silence here, and you let it be broken." A single tear rolled down Keanu's cheek. He closed his hands around the carving, and for a long moment said nothing. But something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just gently, like the desert wind, like healing that no longer needed permission. And then Keanu whispered something, too soft for even the fire to catch, but Traoré heard it. The name, spoken, at last, and the fire didn't roar. It didn't crackle. It simply glowed, steady and warm. Because some names don't need thunder. Some just need silence that finally lets them be heard. The fire didn't react. No spark leapt upward. No sudden gust stirred the trees. But something had changed. The air around them felt denser, softer somehow, like it had been waiting for that one name to be spoken aloud. And now, with it out in the open, the night could finally breathe again. Traoré didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just offered Keanu a steady, silent nod, the kind men give each other when words would only weaken the moment. Keanu sat still, holding the wooden carving tightly in his palm, his thumb moving slowly over the figures back and forth, like a prayer without sound. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, his shoulders lowered. The guilt, though not gone, had shifted, like a shadow that no longer needed to chase him, like a pain that had finally heard itself acknowledged. "I never thought I'd say it," Keanu murmured. "I thought if I kept her name buried, maybe I could bury the pain with it." He looked up at the stars so sharp and clear, like glass nailed into the blackness of the sky. "But I think it wasn't her memory that haunted me. It was my silence." Traoré's gaze didn't leave him. "She lives in that name," he said. "And now, she lives in this fire too." For a while, they watched the flames without, speaking, not in grief anymore, but in something softer. Something like peace. Then Traoré reached into the sand and picked up the pendant and the stone leaf lying side by side. He held them up, one in each hand. 2 tokens from 2 losses. And yet here they are, still intact, still here. He gently tied them together. With a thread he pulled from his wrist-thin, hand-woven fiber from a bracelet. As he knotted it, he spoke. "Sometimes," he said, "we carry pain like separate stones, alone. But they were never meant to be carried alone." He handed the now-joined tokens back to Keanu. "Here, let them carry each other for a while." Keanu took them with trembling fingers, looking down at what was now a symbol, A story of two lives woven together across two continents, bound by the quiet language of loss. "I didn't come here to be healed," Keanu said, his voice still husky. "I just didn't know where else to go." Traoré's expression didn't change, but there was a softness in his eyes now, a warmth. "You didn't come to be healed," he replied. "You came to remember, and that's harder." The fire began to dim as the night grew deeper, stars multiplying above them, vast and endless. And then soft footsteps in the distance. A young soldier approached hesitantly, whispering something in Traoré's ear. Traoré nodded. "There's a child in the village nearby," he explained. "He won't speak. Lost both parents during the floods. Sits by the river all day. Doesn't eat, doesn't cry." Keanu looked at him. "Will you go?" "I was going to," Traoré said. Then he turned and looked at him deeply. "But maybe this time?" "You should." Keanu didn't move at first. The idea felt foreign. He wasn't a leader, not like Traoré. He wasn't someone people listened to because they needed to, only because they wanted to be entertained. But something inside him stirred. A flicker of that same stillness Traoré had described. The one that wraps around your chest, not loud, not demanding, just present. Keanu stood slowly. "Where is he?" Traoré gave simple directions. "Down the trail. You'll see him near the bent tree at the river's edge." Keanu hesitated, then removed his jacket, slung the leather string with the tied tokens around his neck, and walked into the darkness. The path was dim, but not unfamiliar. It felt like the kind of path that only reveals itself when you're ready to walk it. As he moved through the trees, he heard the quiet sounds of insects, the low hum of nightlife still living, even in broken places. And then he saw him, a boy maybe 7 or 8. Sitting cross-legged by the river. Still, stone-like. Keanu didn't approach right away. He just sat a few feet away, folding his legs quietly, matching the boy's posture. No words. No movement. Just presence. The child glanced at him once, then looked away. But he didn't run, didn't scream, didn't cry. Keanu took the wooden carving from his pocket, the one Traoré had given him. The two figures beneath a tree. He placed it gently on the ground between them, then slid it forward slowly, like offering a piece of his heart. The boy stared at it, then at Keanu, then back at the carving. He didn't touch it, but he didn't push it away either. And in that silence, Keanu felt it again, that stillness, that invisible thread. The boy finally reached forward, not for the carving, but for a small stone beside him. He placed it beside the carving, then looked away again. No words, but the message was clear. "I see you. I hear you. I don't know how to speak, but I know you're speaking to me." Keanu smiled. A small, tired smile. The kind that doesn't ask for more. The kind that knows the moment itself is enough. And in that quiet corner of the world, by a river that had swallowed everything the boy had once loved, two souls sat together, saying nothing but healing everything. Back at the camp, Traoré stood at the edge of the fire, watching the sky, whispering something only the wind could carry. Let the broken find the broken. Let them rebuild each other. And miles away, under the bent tree by the river's edge, that's exactly what was happening. The stars were beginning to fade when Keanu returned. The night had shifted toward dawn, that quiet, sacred hour where everything feels suspended, like the world is waiting to exhale. He walked slowly, not because he was tired, but because something in him had settled. Not everything, but enough. Traoré was still by the fire. Though it had burned low now, the flames no longer dancing, just glowing, waiting. Keanu sat beside him again, in the same spot, same silence. He didn't say what happened by the river. He didn't need to. But he did take off the tokens from around his neck, the pendant, the leaf, still tied together, and placed them carefully into the wooden box Traoré had given him. Then closed the lid. "It belongs here," he said. "Not with me." Traoré looked down at the box and nodded. "You returned it better than you found it." Keanu gave a soft breath of a laugh. "Maybe it returned me." They both looked up as the horizon began to warm, a thin line of orange slicing through the deep blue. And for the first time, light touched their faces. Keanu stood, slowly. He reached into his backpack, pulled out a small black notebook, worn, pages curled. He handed it to Traoré. "I've written letters in this for years," he said. "Never sent any of them. Most of them were to her. Some were to myself." Traoré didn't open it. He just accepted it with both hands. "Burn it, bury it, keep it. Do whatever you think is right, but I don't need it anymore." A moment passed between them, heavier than any speech. And then Keanu turned toward the path. Before he took a step, he paused, just once, and looked back. "You sat with me when I had nothing left," he said quietly. "You didn't try to fix me. You just stayed." Traoré met his eyes. "Sometimes," he said, "that's all we're meant to do. No farewell, no embrace. Just a nod, the kind that carries more weight than goodbye." And as Keanu Reeves walked away into the new morning light, there was no music, no applause, no crowd. Just the sound of footsteps on African soil, and a silence that no longer hurt. If this story touched a part of your soul you thought was forgotten, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone whose silence still carries weight. Because sometimes just staying saves someone. Tell us in the comments. Who was the one person who stayed beside you when you said nothing at all? Sometimes healing begins when someone sits beside your silence, not to change it, but to honor it.